For TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jesse Betend, and this is The High Ground. On this show, we talk to the leaders of the cannabis industry, CEOs, farmers, public officials, anyone making an impact on the cannabis industry and beyond. As an essential service, cannabis retail stores have an undisputed advantage over other businesses who've spent the last few months in lockdown. They don't have to reopen because they never shut down. But that does not mean that they should assume that they have everything figured out. I'm joined today by James Schmachtenberger. James is the founder of Mankind Cooperative, a dispensary in San Diego. He's also the CEO of biohacking group Neurohacker Collective, and a guy who's got experience both in the medical field as well as working to change policy relating to cannabis. We'll get into the specific challenges cannabis retailers face in opening back up, goodbye smell jars, and what cannabis can teach other businesses that are starting from scratch. How to educate consumers about safety procedures, how to respond when consumers don't like the new way of doing things or they refuse to follow the rules, and how to prepare your employees for the uncharted interactions that are sure to come. James, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jesse. Appreciate it.
So, going back to the beginning of stay at home and quarantine and sheltering in place, how did you guys adapt immediately as a physical retail location? And what are some of the policies that you kind of put into place?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's something that we started making pretty significant changes around, I think, several weeks before much of the industry did. My background is all in healthcare and medicine. And so I've been paying pretty close attention to what's been happening with COVID for some time, well before any of the kinds of shelter in place orders came. We had started making preparations to ensure people's safety. And there was really quite a lot involved in it to make sure that we did an adequate enough job. For one, we have large scale HEPA filters that we put in place so that we're clearing all of the air in the entire facility approximately every 10 minutes with a small enough micron size to be able to filter out viral load. We immediately took away the use of sort of like the smell jars that people use with display. Because obviously that was a huge thing, right? You don't want people putting their face up against something that someone else just had their face up against. So we took that away at the very beginning. And then again, kind of well before the requirements were there, we started putting in pretty strict sanitization protocols where basically every hour on the hour we went through and sanitized everything all the way down to the level of like doorknobs, keyboards, displays, countertops, etc., to make sure that everybody was safe. And we also started restricting the number of people that were allowed in the store at any given time. And then as things heated up, we just further restricted the number of people. And we also started, very quickly encouraging more customers to pivot to either delivery or pickup options to, again, limit the amount of exposure that was potential. So we were actually in really good position by the time that all of the orders came in place because we had already been doing most of them for 2-3 weeks before there was any requirement to.
What were some of the concerns from employees and how did they kind of adapt to the way that they would have to work?
Yeah, that was actually a pretty significant area for us to have to work through because, it was one of those things where the employees were really appreciative of the fact that we were taking all of the precautions. But in the process of taking precautions, especially before everyone else, it also gave them an opportunity to start thinking about and worrying about COVID before everybody else. So it was a bit of a double-edged sword where they were grateful for what we were doing. And they also had, I think, a slightly increased sense of fear. And there were definitely quite a number of employees that were concerned about whether or not it was safe to continue to work, whether or not, it was reasonable to be around that many people. And what we did with that was we just really tried to stay in very close communication with all of our team and keep them as informed as possible. So we set up a number of like Zoom meetings with our whole team where myself and our COO would get on and give everybody updates on what's happening in COVID, explain some of the science around it, what things they needed to pay attention to and didn't. also opened up the opportunity for people to just bring up any kinds of questions and concerns so that we knew what they were and we could address them. And then we also took it on a very case-by-case basis. Certain employees had higher risk factors than other employees, and certain employees had roles where it was easier to make them remote versus having to stay on site. And so those were all things that we tried to take into account when working with the staff. But I will say that, at the beginning of all this, when it really started to heat up and when California first put its shelter in place program, there was definitely a number of team members that seemed to be pretty nervous and scared about it. And it was, through a combination of staying in close communication with them and educating them that it made a difference, but also helping to remind them of the importance of what their work is. So we talked to the employees a lot about why we actually got designated as an essential business and the important role that cannabis plays in medicine, and in medicine quite broadly, but also, directly in relationship to COVID, where as a result of everything that's happening in the world through COVID, obviously people's stress is substantially higher than it normally is. And people are looking for ways of being able to do stress mitigation. And I've seen a number of reports showing that alcohol sales have jumped up, I believe, like 280% since the beginning of COVID. But that's not a great way to do stress management for this, because drinking alcohol increases aspiration, which has direct negative impacts if someone was to get COVID.
Right.
Whereas using cannabis for stress mitigation doesn't have nearly the same potential for downside. And so helping to remind the staff of the importance of their work, both for the medical users and the fact that in many cases, it's a life and death dynamic or quality of life dynamic for those people to have access to cannabis. And that even for everyone else, just in light of all that's happening in the world, there's a need to be able to serve them for their own normal purposes, but also for being able to have an effective way of healthfully coping with the stress for what's happening in the world. And I think that between feeling like we cared, like having the team really know that we genuinely cared about them and their needs and their safety, and having them remember the important role that they're playing in our customers' lives and in sort of society at large, it seemed to make a huge difference in the morale. And we started to see everyone kind of ease into it more.
When it comes to, like you mentioned removing the smell jars, and obviously customers notice changes and everything is changing. But how important is it for businesses to communicate those changes to your customers, why you're making them, and also communicating the changes that you're making in terms of safety to them so that they understand and feel comfortable coming back into your stores? Like, what's been your approach to that, or your thinking around that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's super important to communicate and, prospectively over communicate when it comes to things like that. Is, when the whole world is changing, everyone's got questions and, are all in a position where they're actively looking for any sense of clarity that they can get. So we made it a point to try to do a lot of communication with our customers, and we're, repeatedly posting updates on social media, sending out email blasts, sending out text blasts, posting notices at the entrance of the store. We wanted to make sure that everyone was informed just in general, but we also wanted to make sure that they understood what sort of safety protocols we were doing that were above and beyond the scope of what were required, to give them a greater sense of security and being able to still come to the store or get a delivery from us. So we did quite a lot of communication, anytime we were changing policies around how we were doing sanitization, or, how many customers were allowed in the store at any given time, or do you have to wear masks or not? Like all those things, we try to make a point of communicating to our customers as quickly and as regularly as we could. And then we also took it, a number of steps past that and tried to provide useful educational information so that people could just better understand what's happening with COVID in general, and then understand anything that they might want to in relationship to cannabis with it. So like one thing we did was we hired a a well-known and well-respected physician locally to come do a webinar for our whole customer community, giving them an overview of COVID, what things they can do to protect themselves, how they can focus on boosting their immunity to limit any unnecessary risk. And then also, giving them a little bit of education on, if you are going to use something for stress management, why cannabis is a better option than alcohol. And then also educating them that, this is probably a good time to start exploring other form factors of cannabis if you're historically someone who just smokes it, because given that COVID is a respiratory disorder, if you actually do get it, you really don't want to do anything else to potentially increase inflammation in the respiratory system. So we were providing education and support and encouragement to have people try edibles and tinctures and other kinds of products that could still get them what they were looking for, but have them have an option where they could continue to have access to cannabis, even if they were having some symptomology and not sure if it was COVID or not. So yeah, we tried to do a lot on the communication side, and that's standard for us, but obviously we have upped the amount of communication we're doing in relationship to COVID, because we just know that people are kind of constantly wondering what's happening, what's next, how does this affect them, how does this affect their access to cannabis? And we wanted to try to do our best to answer as many of those questions as we could preemptively.
As tensions have started to rise, I suppose inevitably, the mask and responses from local governments and cities to the pandemic has become somewhat political. We've heard some stories of people not wearing the mask in public or not perhaps using proper safety guidelines. Just anecdotally, what are you seeing from customers? Are people using the mask? Has that been a problem for you?
I've been pleasantly surprised to see how relatively easily that's gone. Because I'm very well aware of the politicization of this, and I see all of the arguments online of people not wanting to wear masks and all the various reasons for that. But I'll say that overall with our customers, they've actually been quite good with it. We've had a couple instances of someone who would show up and really didn't want to wear a mask and was upset that we wouldn't allow them in without it. But I mean, for one, we're required to mandate masks at this point. So beyond the scope of our own policy, it's something we're going to enforce no matter what. We also have, helped to make that easier, where we ordered a supply of masks, and if a customer did show up and didn't have a mask, we were able to give them one so that they could still come in. But kind of amazingly, we haven't actually had to give out that many masks, which I'm happy about, because getting access to them right now has been abnormally difficult.
Yeah,
but we see quite a lot of people per day. And I would say since the mandates in our area went in for masks being a requirement, we're probably only seeing maybe 3 to 5 people per day that are showing up without a mask. And then most of them have been totally happy to take one from us and use it without any, concern or complaint.
It really does put the whole sort of like inability to get people to bring their shopping bag to the grocery store into perspective, when I feel like everybody just adopted the mask. But, life or death maybe helps with habit change. That's really interesting. And you crossed one of my questions off the list, which was, should businesses have a stockpile of extra masks for people if they show up without them? Is there any training that you're giving to your employees for how to handle a customer who doesn't want to follow the rules? Is it about just explaining, hey, this is like coming at it with empathy and kind of saying like, this is about everybody's safety and we're really sorry to put you out, but, or is it just, keep it real simple and say like, this is the policy?
No, I mean, you definitely hit it on the head with the empathy term. Right? Like, no one under almost any circumstance likes hearing that they can or can't do something just because it's policy. Like, this is not a thing that humans tend to respond super well to. So, of course, that's true, right? It is both our corporate policy and it's the policy of the government that you can't come in without a mask. So, like, it's fine to inform that, but just putting that out there does have more of a tendency of creating unnecessary upset. And so, yeah, I mean, as much as our staff are definitely instructed that they have to enforce the policy and to try to do that in the most compassionate, understanding, empathetic way possible, because people do have very, very strong feelings around this at this point. There's obviously a slew of different conspiracy type theories that are out there. There's question marks from certain medical professionals that have been brought up as to whether or not masks are actually safer or if they cause more harm. So I can understand and put myself in the position of different viewpoints and see why people might be averse to wearing a mask. And if someone is not wanting to, just trying to kind of push them generally isn't going to create nearly as much benefit as trying to understand them and then present the information to them in a way that works for them. Make it about the safety of others, help them be able to tap into their own care and compassion for the people that might be affected by them not wanting to wear a mask. We have had a few instances where that didn't work and we just had to tell people that they weren't allowed in. But as much as possible, we've tried to work with the team and, communicate to them and train them to be as understanding and compassionate as possible, recognize that almost everyone's going through a hard time right now. And even if they wouldn't normally be upset, they will be more prone to be during this time, and to just try to be extra understanding, extra compassionate, but also hold a firm line around what the policies are, because ultimately they are there for safety, and that takes precedence over anything.
So, as we kind of touched on, cannabis has a bit of a head start as an essential business. Did you seek any legal counsel in terms of liability, things that, potential blind spots that you might not see about safely running the business? And is that something that you think business owners should be doing?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the rules around how companies have to interact related to COVID have been changing, quite quickly. Sometimes there's total policy revisions every few days, and there's so many pieces to it that without having legal counsel involved, the likelihood of missing something or doing something inaccurate is just too high. So throughout the whole process, we've been very closely in communication with our legal counsel on both the regulatory front as well as our legal counsel as it pertains to employment law, and making sure that we're doing everything correctly, both in terms of our employees as well as state laws and city laws. And in certain circumstances, we also worked with our legal counsel to get temporary modifications to regulations so as to be able to provide cannabis more safely for people. As an example, typically curbside pickup is not allowable, and we've done pickup orders for a long time where someone could place an order online and then come to the store and pick it up, but they didn't have to ever wait in line or go through the shopping experience. But when you're trying to limit potential interactions with people, still having them come into the store isn't ideal if you have another option. And so we advocated pretty strongly with both the city and the state to be able to get approvals to allow for curbside pickup so that someone could place their order online, pull into the parking lot, we'd be notified that they were there, and then could bring their order straight to them. So we worked with legal counsel both to make sure we understood all of the policies and were following them, but also to try to advance certain policies that would actually make a material impact on the safety. And that was sort of a key one that we were able to be successful with, and have been quite happy about that because it's allowed us to have a pretty large percentage of our total customer base be able to come through the sort of curbside option where there's really no need for human contact throughout the process.
Looking forward, what are some of the sort of long-term changes that you're expecting or anticipating? I mean, will the smell jars return, at some point, as an example?
I mean, at some point, the answer is almost definitely yes. At what point is definitely the question mark, right? I'm playing this a lot more conservatively than most people are. I see a lot of businesses that are rushing to reopen or wanting to make changes as quickly as they're allowed to, and that's definitely not our position. Our position is, we'll loosen restrictions and open things up once it's both allowable under law, but also once we've made our own determinations regarding safety for our team and for our customers. And so, yes, smell jars will come back, but my guess is that's actually a little ways down the line based on what I'm seeing in terms of the trends of COVID and, a number of areas that are starting to show recent spikes as openings are beginning again. So that'll come back. But I think one of the things that I'm expecting to be a likely significant change in the industry that will probably last for an extended period of time is I suspect that a lot more of the cannabis industry will operate through online ordering and delivery and pickup, even once COVID is no longer a thing. Because though there is obviously a very special experience being able to go into a dispensary and see all the products and touch them and talk to people in person, so many people now that were doing that have pivoted over to either delivery or pickup options. And, those also have certain selling points regarding, convenience and ease and not having to go anywhere if you don't want to. So I'm anticipating that even as the restrictions start to ease and people are able to go back to shopping as normal, my guess is that some relatively large percentage of the people who have pivoted from the in-store experience to, like, let's say the delivery experience will actually just continue that as their predominant way of getting cannabis. And not as many people will come back to stores right away. And I think a lot of that will also depend on how long the COVID shutdowns actually last, right? So far, it's still relatively short, right? Most people have been quarantined for anywhere from maybe 6 to 10 weeks, depending on what area they're in. And so right now, I think for a lot of people, it still feels like a sort of blip in history, and people are holding out and kind of hoping that life is just going to get back to normal. But if this continues for much longer, where people are in a modified version of life for months and months on end, then that's going to start to adapt and become the new normal. And then they probably won't just as readily flip back to whatever their previous behaviors were. And I think in this regard, that's going to be, seeing a consistent increase in delivery and pickup, even when COVID starts to normalize. And I also suspect that some of the changes that we're seeing in terms of what types of products people are purchasing will also sustain, at least to some extent. Like when you look at a lot of the trends, there's been slight dips in the amount of sales for inhalables, and there's been increases in most of the consumables, edibles, tinctures, capsules. And I think that some of that will actually probably stick as well, where we'll see a continual increase in popularity around edibles and tinctures and things like that, and not everyone just rushing right back to smoking. But I think that this is giving people an opportunity to try different form factors of cannabis that they maybe haven't before. And I think a lot of people will find that they're actually coming across something that works even better for them than what they had previously been accustomed to.
Beyond Mankind, you do a lot of work in a lot of different areas. I guess my last question for you would be, what's next for you? What are you working on that you're excited about? And have you had to maybe pivot at all based on what's going on in the world?
Good question. Well, the answer is definitely yes. There's been a lot of pivots that had to happen. We've significantly changed the way that we operate the company already as a result of COVID. Previous to this whole thing, I would say a little under 10% of our sales were either delivery or pickup, and most of it was in store. And since COVID, it's almost half of our sales are either delivery or pickup. So that's been a very significant material change, and we're continuing to adapt the business as needed to all of that. One of the things that's been sort of significantly at least temporarily interrupted in terms of COVID is access to funding. And that's not just specific to cannabis, that's across the board. Like, I also run companies in other industries, and in general, when COVID started, we saw, significant tightening of the capital markets where people wanted to hold off on making investments until they had a better handle on how this was going to play out and what the larger economic factors were going to be. And so I think that, that's something that changed quite a bit. And in the last couple of weeks, I'm starting to see that ease up more. But I think that that's going to have a lot of impact on the cannabis space because, with the big dip that we saw in the cannabis market a handful of months ago when all the big public companies lost all that valuation, that already created capital restrictions. And then with COVID, that created further capital restrictions. And so I think we're going to see a much more cautious approach to expansion within the industry as things start to open back up. I don't think that people will be dumping the kinds of money in that they have for just sort of rampant expansion without a focus on profitability. So those are all things that are changing. In terms of what's sort of up and coming and next for me, a big part of it is we just want to continue to offer the absolute best service and products that we can at Mankind and to continually adapt and develop that to be, an even greater experience. I am, definitely working on and interested in expanding and opening new retail facilities. And then I'm also doing quite a lot of R&D and work right now into product development. Outside of this space, I also run another company, which is a R&D company that focuses on human optimization. And we have quite a lot of very advanced science that's based off of complex system science modeling. And so one of the things that I've been working on and looking at over the last little while is how do we take some of the scientific advances that we've done in other industries with, deep focus on being able to address particular conditions and or being able to optimize parts of physiology and psychology, and how do we bring that into the cannabis space? And so that then starts to look like being able to develop complex formulas that include, cannabinoids and terpenes, but also include various types of nutraceutical ingredients, different botanicals and amino acids and minerals and et cetera, where we can use the synergistic properties of all of those different items together to be able to produce significantly stronger effects for whatever the end user is looking for. Like, for instance, everyone knows at this point that, cannabis is good for anxiety or, good for sleep or things like that. But it can be made even more powerful when you start to understand the science at a deep enough level, and you can start to pair it with other kinds of ingredients that are also good for those same needs and be able to play off the synergies between the different ingredients to be able to have an even greater effect. So that's an area that I'm putting a lot of time and attention and thought into, as well as active research, so that we can be able to really advance the medicinal side of this industry as much as possible. And then on the back of that, to be able to do similar things on the more recreational side, where, again, we can take cannabinoids and terpenes and blend them with other kinds of legal psychoactive botanicals that have a more specific impact. So rather than, like, for instance, rather than going to a store and buying a cartridge that is strain specific, you would go and you'd buy a vape cartridge that was specific to a state that you wanted to be in, right? So you'd go and get one that was called laughter or deep relaxation or arousal or whatever the use case is, but where we would, again, pair different kinds of ingredients together to be able to have a much more consistent and more effective experience at that thing that you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, that's really fascinating stuff. And when you're ready to talk about it, we would absolutely love to have you back on.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd love to do another interview where we could actually dive into that, because it is pretty intriguing. And I think it's actually sort of the next phase of the cannabis industry, independent of anything having to do with COVID. I think that, cannabis is starting to move more and more into the wellness space. And as people are starting to look at it as more of a well-being product, the way that they might with, supplements or things like that, there's an interest in seeing how far that can be advanced and how much benefit can be provided. And that goes beyond the scope of just, optimizing the amount of THC in the product. It gets into the development of different synergies between ingredients. And I think that we're going to see actually quite a lot in that regard starting to come out in the industry over the next few years.
James Schmachtenberger, founder of Mankind Cooperative, a dispensary in San Diego. He's also the CEO of biohacking group Neurohacker Collective, and a guy who's got experience both in the medical field as well as working to change policy relating to cannabis. You can find more cannabis industry reporting at TRICHOMES.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground@trichomes.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at trichomes.com and following us on all social media. The High Ground is produced by David Fortin. I'm Jesse Betend, and thank you for listening.